World Geography, East Asia, Population Issues. Here are the learning objectives. 1. Analyze China's one-child policy. 2. Explain Mao's policies following the Communist Revolution. 3. How did the Chinese stimulate economic growth after Mao's death? 4. How do Japan's population problems differ from those in China? China's one-child policy. One-child policy. In 1979, the Chinese government, they began a family planning program. They called it the one-child policy. Each married couple, they were limited to just one child, but there were some exceptions. There were 3 of them. The first exception, if both members of a married couple came from single-children households, then they could have a second child. Second exception, couples in rural areas, they could also have a second child. Third exception, there were no limitations placed on ethnic minorities. And also, there were no limitations placed on foreigners living in China. Success. The one-child policy, it's slowly decreasing the birth rate in China and the population. And China is moving towards zero population growth. Slower population growth has many benefits. Some of these include reducing the strain on food and water supplies. A slower population will lessen the problem of having too many workers for too few jobs. And slower population growth means that mothers and babies are generally healthier. Babies are usually healthier in small families. And with fewer children to care for, women have more time for a career. Failure. The one-child policy has not been completely successful, and there's some reasons for that. First reason is that uneducated peasants in the rural areas, they really don't like to be told how many children they can have, so they resist the policy. The second reason for it not being completely successful is that cultural tradition in China favors sons over daughters because sons are expected to care for the aging parents. After all, daughters leave the parents to become part of the husband's family. So you don't really count on your daughter to look after you in your old age. You count on your son. And although illegal, some couples in China, rather than give birth to a girl, they'll choose to end the pregnancy and then try again for a boy. Communism under Mao. Economic isolationism. Under the communist rule of Mao Zedong, which went from 1949 to 1976, the goal of the rule was to make China economically self-sufficient. In order to achieve this policy, China limited interactions with foreign business persons, and unelected government officials, like in any communist state, they decided what goods should be produced and at what price. And again, like in any other communist country, the government controlled who should do what job and for what pay. Great Leap Forward. The first program that Mao came up with was the Great Leap Forward. This ran from 1958 to 1960. And the goal of the Great Leap Forward was to hasten the process of industrialization and increase agricultural production. It was pretty much a failure, led to the deaths of millions of people from starvation and forced labor. Cultural Revolution. Since the Great Leap Forward really wasn't much of a success, Mao felt that his power was being threatened by those who had disagreed with the policy. And so to increase his hold on power, to make sure that he wasn't being questioned by others, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, which ran from 1966 to 76. And his aim here was to create a new society in China. Anyone suspected of not being loyal to the communists, they were sent to prison. Schools closed as students joined Mao's movement, and factory and farm production declined because there weren't enough workers. They were all in the streets protesting. Economic growth. Foreign investment. Upon Mao's death, China's leaders, they were more interested at this point in boosting the economic growth rather than in changing society. So China's leaders, they made plans to open up the economy to the rest of the world. They really hoped that foreign companies would come to China and start a business, create new jobs, and also bring modern technology with them. However, they knew that foreigners, they would not come to China if the government planned to control their businesses. So they had to come up with a new strategy. Special economic zones. So in order to encourage foreign businesses to move to China, China set up these special economic zones. They're called SEZs. And in the SEZ, the laws were different from those in the rest of the country. If you operated your business within the SEZ, then you had the freedom to decide what goods that you would produce and at what prices you would sell them. And most goods produced in the SEZs, they were pretty much for export to other countries. Most of the jobs in the SEZs, they were filled by migrant workers from the rural areas. Wasn't enough work in the rural areas, so there were migrant workers, rural workers were beginning to move to the cities. These workers, these rural workers at these new factories, they were able to make enough money to support themselves, and then they also sent money home back to the village to support their families. SEZ problems. Special economic zones. They've created some problems in China. First one is that SEZs have created a lot of wealth, but that wealth really hasn't spread to the rural areas. The second problem is a floating population of migrant workers who drift back and forth between their village and the SEZs, which are mostly located in coastal regions. These migrants often find only really low-paying part-time jobs, and it's increased the crime rate. People are looking for enough money to survive on, even if they have to steal it. Population density in Japan. Definition. Population density. It's the average number of persons in an area, such as a square mile or a square kilometer. The population density of Japan, 880 persons per square mile. Just compare that to the United States, population density here in the United States is 83 persons per square mile. So 880 in Japan, 83 in the United States. The Tokyo metropolitan area has 35 million inhabitants. Very crowded. Population distribution. Many areas in Japan far too mountainous to support any large town or city. The majority of Japan's 127 million people, they live on the 4 main islands. And 80% of the population, they live on flat land near the coast or in the narrow river valleys. So you can't just live wherever you want to in Japan. Not all of it is habitable. You can't live in the mountains. So most people are crowded along the coastal regions. Transportation. In Japan, there's an extensive and a very efficient public transportation system. Underground subways, they run beneath most of the major cities. And there are fast bullet trains. They're called Shinkansen. Excuse my pronunciation. The bullet trains travel between the major cities. Due to overcrowding, city residents, they really can't own a car unless they can prove to the authorities that they have a place off the street to park it. Housing. Because flat land for building is so scarce in Japan, housing is very expensive. And so many families, they live in apartments. And the apartments are no larger, say, than a typical family room in an American home. They just make good use of the space. Land use. Due to these land shortages, the Japanese, they've found lots of different ways to use the land and also methods to create new land. One thing that the Japanese have done to make good use of the land is to use earthquake-resistant construction techniques and build extremely high skyscrapers. Also, the Japanese make use of the land under the ground. They build subterranean shopping centers. The Japanese have also created new land by filling in the shallow wetlands around cities with dirt and rubble. And another thing when it comes to farming is they've used the terrace farming technique where they cut the steps into the hillside and farm on the steps, much like the Inca did in the Andes, which we spoke about earlier in the year. The end. Thank you for your attention.